something important has shifted in the Iran standoff, and the signals coming out of Tehran are no longer pointing to calm management. They point to strain, improvisation, and a system operating much closer to its limits than officials would like to admit. What is unfolding now does not look like a deliberate long-term plan. It looks increasingly like emergency management under pressure. Iran is not only facing pressure from abroad, it is also showing visible signs of internal stress. That matters, because in a closed political system, public signs of disunity are rare, and when they appear, they usually mean the underlying situation is already serious. At the center of the current crisis is Kharg Island, the strategic hub that handles most of Iran's oil exports. Instead of operating smoothly, that system now appears to be slowing under heavy strain. Reports describe serious disruption in the movement of oil in and out, raising concerns that one of Iran's most vital economic arteries is approaching a bottleneck. The clearest sign of distress is that Iran has reportedly reactivated a vessel that had been left unused for more than 3 decades and is now using it as a floating oil storage facility. That is not the kind of step a country takes when its normal infrastructure is functioning well. It is the kind of step taken when storage capacity is under pressure and time is running short. Analysts say the ship had remained idle in port for years and is now being brought back into service in a storage role. That decision suggests Iran's existing storage network is becoming overloaded. It also suggests that officials are searching for temporary space wherever they can find it. But the capacity of that vessel is finite. At roughly 3.9 million barrels, it may sound significant, yet it is still limited when measured against daily production. If exports remain restricted and production continues, that storage would fill quickly, leaving Iran with fewer and fewer workable options. That is the real problem now taking shape. If Tehran cannot export enough oil and also cannot store what it produces, the system begins to choke on itself. Once that happens, every option becomes more costly, more risky, and harder to reverse. Seen from a military and logistical perspective, this is not a strategic breakthrough. It is a stopgap measure designed to buy time. And stopgap measures can be useful for a while, but they also reveal that deeper structural problems are no longer theoretical. The use of an old, long idle vessel for floating storage has also raised questions about operational safety. A platform that has not been maintained for many years carries obvious risks, including leakage, technical failure, and environmental damage. In the oil trade, even a small malfunction can have consequences far beyond the immediate site. That concern has led many observers to ask a basic question. Why is a country handling a strategic national resource relying on aging equipment whose technical condition may not be fully verified? The answer, at least from the outside, appears to be straightforward because the pressure on the system has become too intense to ignore. At the same time, criticism has emerged over what some see as a muted response from environmental groups. Organizations that often react strongly to energy-related safety risks have not shown the same level of visibility here. Some commentators argue that this reflects a double standard, with much of the international spotlight remaining fixed on the United States and Israel, while concerns tied to Iran receive less attention. All of this is happening as pressure from Washington appears to be increasing. According to current reports, President Donald Trump has instructed aides to prepare for a long-term blockade strategy aimed at Iran. If implemented and sustained, that approach would intensify the pressure on an economy that remains heavily dependent on oil revenue. This is not simply an economic measure in the narrow sense. It is a strategic attempt to target the financial foundation of the Iranian state. The underlying logic is clear. Restrict oil exports, squeeze government revenue, and force Tehran into harder choices at home and abroad. Iran's central bank has reportedly warned the government that a prolonged blockade could produce severe national economic consequences. That warning is significant because it suggests concern is no longer confined to political rhetoric. Financial institutions inside the system appear to be recognizing the scale of the threat. In recent discussions, Trump is said to have chosen to keep increasing pressure with a direct focus on oil exports. The main method being discussed is the obstruction of Iranian tankers, with the aim of disrupting the energy flow that keeps the country's economy alive. Once transport routes are tightened and storage nears capacity, Iran is pushed into a position where every path carries risk. From the American side, reports suggest that after evaluating a range of options, officials concluded that a sustained blockade carried fewer risks than alternative approaches. It is seen as less resource-intensive than direct military escalation, while still capable of imposing tangible economic pain. In that sense, it is being framed not as a temporary signal, but as a long-duration pressure tool. What makes this more consequential is the claim that the strategy is already producing results. Iranian officials and their supporters initially accused Washington of dragging itself toward another dangerous confrontation. Yet, despite that criticism, Tehran has still returned to the negotiating table, which, from the perspective of the White House, is evidence that pressure is working. Even so, the door to diplomacy has not been presented as open without conditions. Trump has maintained that negotiations are possible only if the nuclear issue is central to the discussion. In practical terms, that means Iran would be expected to give up activities linked to the development of that capability, or at the very least, put them squarely on the table. If that condition is not met, the American position suggests there is little value in further talks. That hard line has sharpened the central question of this entire confrontation. Which side is truly setting the pace now, and which side is reacting? The pressure campaign has not been limited to policy channels. Trump has also escalated the confrontation rhetorically through social media, using Truth Social to attack the German leadership in blunt terms. In the message described in the reports, he accused the German chancellor of suggesting that allowing Iran to possess weapons could be acceptable, then argued that such a position would endanger the whole world. He went further, saying that he was now taking action on Iran and doing what previous presidents should have done long ago. He also tied that argument to criticism of Germany's present economic and broader performance. The post quickly fueled debate, not only because of its content, but because of its effect on relations among allies. Some critics argued that the tone was unnecessarily confrontational and risked worsening tensions inside the Western camp. Others shifted attention to Germany's own vulnerabilities, especially the pressure on its once dominant auto industry from rising Chinese competition. From that viewpoint, Berlin should be focused more on domestic economic challenges and less on statements likely to complicate an already delicate diplomatic environment. That diplomatic sensitivity matters because Germany has also been seen as trying to improve relations with the United States. Comments perceived as ambiguous on Iran could therefore create the opposite effect, making the broader alliance conversation even more difficult. In a crisis this volatile, words from major capitals are not separate from policy. They become part of the pressure structure itself. Meanwhile, the energy market is reacting in real time. Reports indicate that the blockade strategy has increased concern about global supply disruption and helped push oil prices higher in the short term. That price movement reflects just how sensitive the energy markets remain to instability in the Middle East. Still, Iran is not the only variable in the global supply picture. Output from countries such as Venezuela, along with increases from other regions, has partially eased fears of an immediate shortage. But partial relief is not the same as replacement, and few analysts believe those sources can fully compensate for the potential loss of Iranian barrels. Against that background, Trump has reportedly described what he called a three-step Iranian plan. According to that description, Tehran first wants maritime access reopened, then a partial suspension of pressure, and only after that would it move to full negotiations. From Washington's standpoint, that sequence is being interpreted as an attempt to lower immediate pressure before making any substantive concession. Because of that, the American position appears unchanged. The blockade is to remain in place indefinitely as a strategic lever. Officials argue that there is no reason to relax a measure that is already weakening Iran's economic base. According to that view, the objective is straightforward: drive Iranian oil exports down to almost zero and strike directly at the national budget if oil revenue is the central pillar of the economy. Then restricting it becomes the central instrument of coercion. The confrontation has therefore entered a new phase, one in which economic warfare is being used in place of direct military confrontation. A specialist cited in the reporting from the Brookings Institution said Iran is now testing the limits of its own endurance, trying to outlast the blockade while facing growing risks of energy disruption and global economic slowdown. That observation broadens the picture beyond the bilateral conflict. It suggests the consequences of this standoff do not stop at the Iran border. The current energy shock has already pushed oil prices upward and revived concerns about inflation and weaker global growth. That is why this crisis cannot be understood only as a contest between Washington and Tehran. It is also a stress test for a world economy that remains vulnerable to energy volatility. The picture, however, is not entirely one-sided. Iran has previously been criticized for its handling of domestic protests, and some observers argue that the leadership has shown a willingness to prioritize political survival over public welfare. Yet the United States is not insulated from the fallout either, because higher energy prices can feed inflation at home and raise recession risks. That mutual exposure is what makes the present phase so serious. Iran is facing a level of pressure that appears different from earlier sanction periods. In previous rounds, oil could still move through indirect channels and intermediary networks, but the current blockade model is described as far more restrictive, pushing exports toward a near standstill. At the same time, transport routes are no longer operating normally. That means the core source of state revenue is being cut off with unusual speed. And with domestic storage also approaching its limits, Tehran is dealing with a double squeeze, a logistics crisis on one side and a fiscal crisis on the other. In that situation, simply reducing oil production is not an easy solution. Shutting down oil fields abruptly can cause long-term damage and reduce their future recovery potential. Even if production can later be restored, the cost of bringing the system back online could run into tens of billions of dollars, while output may still struggle to return to previous levels. That is a burden any government would hesitate to accept, especially when revenue is already under strain. Pressure is also expanding beyond the energy sector itself. Measures from the United States Treasury are reportedly extending into the financial system, targeting not only formal channels, but also informal transaction networks, including underground banking and cryptocurrency activity. The result is an increasingly comprehensive squeeze. It is not only the oil flow that is being constrained, but the money flow as well. When both of those lifelines are tightened at the same time, the state's ability to maintain stability becomes much more fragile. That helps explain why Iran appears increasingly interested in opening channels for dialogue. Yet the larger question remains unanswered. How long can the country's financial system hold under pressure that is now spreading through the broader economic and social structure? For the ruling class, the top priority is always the survival of the governing apparatus. That includes the Revolutionary Guard, the military, and the wider state bureaucracy. But as available funding narrows, maintaining those patronage networks becomes more difficult. And that is when internal instability can become more dangerous than outside pressure. Recent signs suggest Iran is no longer dealing only with external coercion. It is also confronting the possibility of internal fracture. Public discontent alone may not be enough to trigger a major political break, but if dissatisfaction spreads into armed institutions, the situation could become much harder to control. That possibility matters because the most notable recent development inside Iran is the visible emergence of divisions among hardline factions. These are not minor disagreements at the margins. They are appearing in a part of the political system that has long projected discipline and unity. State-linked and factional media are now openly criticizing one another for a system built on controlled messaging. That is an unusual signal. It suggests that the struggle is no longer being contained behind closed doors. According to Iranian international broadcasting and related reporting, some ultra-conservative factions are no longer fully aligned with central command. Instead of repeating a single official line, they are challenging one another in public. That is a rare development in Iran's tightly managed power structure, and it points to a more serious internal dispute over strategy and authority. The White House, for its part, says its pressure campaign is achieving important goals. A spokesperson said that the successful blockade of Iranian ports has given Washington meaningful leverage in talks aimed at stopping weapons development. Trump's position remains firm. Only an agreement that protects American national security interests will be acceptable. The administration has also repeated that any peace arrangement must fully address the nuclear issue. That is being presented as a non-negotiable red line. From the American perspective, accepting less would weaken the leverage created by the current pressure campaign. Analysts say Washington's rejection of recent Iranian proposals is therefore not surprising. If those proposals do not reach the core issue, there is little incentive for the United States to alter its position and the blockade is still producing pressure. In simple terms, if the current strategy is working, the White House sees no reason to change it quickly. Iran, meanwhile, has said it needs more time to prepare a new proposal and must consult with senior leadership. But even that statement points to a deeper problem. Real power in Iran does not rest entirely with official negotiators or office holders. It is heavily shaped by institutions such as the Revolutionary Guard, making decision-making slower, more fragmented, and less predictable. While that process drags on, the storage situation is getting tighter. Regional observers increasingly doubt that Tehran's next proposal will create a breakthrough. Iran continues to insist that it retains control over the Strait area and demands that the United States abandon its maximum pressure strategy. But the reality on the ground is described very differently. According to assessments cited in the reports, American forces currently hold the operational advantage. Both sides appear to believe that time favors them. But that does not mean time has equal value for both. If Iran continues trying to endure while its resources steadily erode, the risk of a deep economic crisis will become much more pronounced. And if that happens, the internal cracks now coming into view could become the decisive factor. In many prolonged confrontations, external pressure starts the crisis, but internal division determines the outcome. That internal dimension is now impossible to ignore. Reports indicate that disagreements over how to deal with the United States are spreading even within groups once considered among the most ideologically consistent. The divisions are not limited to formal state institutions. They extend into the factions that had previously maintained at least the appearance of a common front. In response, some officials and associated social media accounts have repeatedly posted messages emphasizing unity, but statements declaring that there is no division have been met with skepticism. Critics argue that such messaging is largely performative and may reflect pressure from the Revolutionary Guard rather than genuine consensus. Subsequent developments seem to support that skepticism. The divisions have not faded from view. They have become more explicit and harder to manage. One of the clearest signs was the reported withdrawal of signatures by some ultra-conservative lawmakers from a letter supporting the government's negotiating team. That move quickly triggered broader controversy, spilling into media circles aligned with the same wider political camp. Public confrontations of this kind are highly unusual and suggest a struggle that has moved beyond ordinary policy disagreement. Some of the outlets involved are believed to have direct ties to the Revolutionary Guard. That has raised further suspicion that what appears on the surface as political debate may also reflect intervention from powerful security actors behind the scenes. In such a system, public messaging is rarely just messaging. It is often an instrument of internal competition. At the core of this dispute is a long-running rivalry among factions aligned with different political figures and power centers. Influence, access, and institutional control are all at stake. Some assessments suggest these internal disputes have disrupted the negotiation process between the United States and Iran, which, according to the transcript, was recently conducted in Islamabad with representatives from both sides. Iranian media reported that as many as 27 lawmakers withdrew their signatures from a statement supporting the negotiating team and its chief representative. Among them were 7 lawmakers from the ultra-conservative camp. That number points to organized resistance rather than isolated unease. The criticism did not stop there. Some lawmakers who had previously taken part in negotiating efforts publicly claimed that red lines had been crossed. They accused the current team of discussing issues with the United States that should never have been on the table. Those accusations matter because they imply that opposition to the talks may not simply be personal or ideological. It may reflect institutional interests tied to the Revolutionary Guard and the broader security establishment. If so, the challenge facing negotiators is not only foreign pressure, it is the possibility that parts of their own system do not want them to succeed on acceptable terms. That raises a basic question about the substance of any talks now taking place. Do the people at the table actually have the authority to decide? If real power lies elsewhere, then the negotiation process risks becoming symbolic, producing movement in appearance but not in outcome. That uncertainty has fueled an increasingly aggressive wave of criticism from hardline lawmakers and commentators. In recent days, they have intensified their attacks on the negotiating camp, creating what looks like a concentrated pressure campaign. Some voices have even demanded that senior figures publicly explain the current situation, especially after the prolonged absence of certain high-level personalities from public view. The result is a growing lack of transparency around who is making decisions and where actual authority resides. In an already tense environment, opacity amplifies suspicion. And suspicion, when it spreads across competing elite factions, can be destabilizing even before any formal split occurs. One particularly controversial article was reportedly removed soon after publication. It had referred to the possibility of rebellion within the ruling structure and even suggested that some of the evidence was being produced by insiders themselves. Those are serious accusations in any system, but especially in one that relies on the projection of internal discipline. The article also implied that some figures may be trying to shift the balance of power through negotiations with the United States. In the current Iranian political climate, that is an extremely sensitive claim. It frames diplomacy not as statecraft, but as a possible vehicle for elite realignment. Hardline commentary has gone even further, arguing that demands such as full sanctions relief or a complete halt to American support for regional allies are unrealistic, and that negotiations are therefore meaningless from the start. Some pieces have also referred to the power of people in the streets as a political force. That is a dangerous theme in a system deeply wary of social unrest. The information battle has not remained verbal alone. Another media outlet strongly pushed back against earlier accusations, only to later withdraw its own content and claim it had merely been citing another source. It then turned around and accused its rivals of provoking instability and threatening national security. In an even sharper turn, some critics alleged that such behavior was effectively serving Trump's plans inside Iran once political opponents begin accusing one another of aiding a foreign adversary. The argument has moved well beyond normal factional competition. It becomes a struggle over legitimacy itself. Alongside these rhetorical clashes, security measures have reportedly increased. Several individuals have been arrested for activities described as suspicious. Authorities have also accused some media platforms of assisting the United States and Israel, and even certain state-affiliated outlets have come under investigation for alleged bias. That suggests information control is being tightened across the board. When a government starts narrowing the range of permissible narratives during an external crisis, it usually means internal anxieties are rising as well. Stability is no longer being defended only through policy. It is also being defended through censorship, surveillance, and legal pressure. There are even reports that some media institutions may reduce open coverage in order to avoid escalating tensions further. Yet that move in itself reveals how difficult the internal situation has become. When channels of public discussion contract while unresolved, rivalries continue to build, crisis management becomes more fragile, not less. Taken together, the message is clear. Whether Iran chooses to continue negotiating or to harden its position further, it is now confronting a larger challenge than external sanctions alone. The deeper problem is division within the leadership itself. Once those divisions become visible in public, repairing them is rarely simple. Each faction begins to calculate not only how to respond to the outside world, but how to protect its own place within the system. That changes the nature of decision-making. It slows consensus, complicates diplomacy, and increases the risk of strategic miscalculation. So this is where the situation stands. Iran is under mounting external pressure from a blockade strategy designed to squeeze oil exports, limit revenue, and force concessions. At the same time, it is dealing with a storage problem that has become so severe that an old vessel has been pulled back into service as a floating reservoir. It is also facing rising energy market consequences that extend beyond the region, pushing oil prices higher and reviving inflation concerns globally. And perhaps most importantly, it is showing signs of internal fragmentation at a moment when cohesion matters most. That combination is what makes this phase of the confrontation so dangerous. The external campaign may be designed in Washington, but the outcome may depend just as much on what happens inside Tehran. If the government can maintain control over its institutions and preserve enough revenue and keep elite divisions from widening, it may still buy itself time. But if financial pressure and internal mistrust continue to reinforce one another, the crisis could deepen far faster than either side publicly admits. For now, neither side appears ready to step back. Washington believes sustained pressure is strengthening its leverage. Tehran appears to believe it can still endure, negotiate selectively, and avoid strategic surrender. But endurance has limits, and systems under pressure often reveal their weakness, not all at once, but through a series of improvised decisions, public contradictions, and institutional strains. That is why the reactivation of an abandoned storage vessel, the tightening of financial controls, and the growing conflict among hardline factions all matter. They are not isolated developments. They are connected signs of a state being tested on several fronts at once. What happens next will depend on whether this pressure remains contained within the realm of bargaining or spills over into something larger, a deeper economic breakdown, a sharper internal rupture, or a broader shock to regional and global markets. For now, the signs from Tehran suggest a leadership trying to hold the line while the space to maneuver grows narrower. And that may be the most important fact in this entire story. The issue is no longer only whether Iran can resist external pressure, it is whether it can do so while managing the fractures that are emerging within its own power structure. If those fractures widen, they may shape the next stage of this crisis more decisively than any statement issued abroad.